Israel, the nation of Hebrew. Israel is a country situated in Middle East which can be found over in those southern east and northern shores of Mediterranean and Red Sea. According to the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics, the population of the city was 8,541,000 in 2016. It is a land full of breathtaking sights and fascinating histories. Israel's official language is called Hebrew. It is regarded as one of the spoken languages of the Israelites and their longest surviving descendants. It was largely preserved throughout history as the main liturgical language of Judaism and Samaritanism. Furthermore, Hebrew is the only Canaanite language that is still spoken today, and it is the only example of a dead language that has been successfully revived. One thing to remember is that Hebrew refers to both the language and the people. According to biblical tradition, the Hebrews are peoples descended from Shem, one of Noah's sons, through Eber and the eponymous ancestor in Abraham. To know more about this, listen and learn as we discover Hebrew literature. How did the Hebrew language survive for over 2,000 years as an effective tool for creative self-expression and intercommunication without the existence of a state or territory as a necessary factor for survival? How did Hebrew maintain its vibrancy and flexibility in the face of such adversity for such a long time? Good day everyone! Today, Group 6 will discuss about the Hebrew, the nature of its language, poetry, and prose, as well as the masterpieces of the Jewish people. For now, let's first talk about the nature of the Hebrew language. Hebrew is the official language of the State of Israel. It is a Semitic language spoken by Jews and one of the oldest living languages on the world. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters and is read from right to left. Hebrew has been the sacred language of the Jewish people, the language of its religion, culture, and civilization. It has been in some the language of Judaism and intimately identified with the national and religious experiences of the Jewish people throughout the generation. In addition, the nature of the Hebrew language must be properly considered. Firstly, its most evident flaw is its lack of abstract and broad knowledge. There are no philosophical or scientific terms in it. Almost every word has a definite meaning and that may be seen even in figurative usage. When we say abstract words, it is a feeling that can be seen, that can be smelled, tasted, or heard. In Psalms 103 verse 8 contains an example of abstract thought. The Lord is compassionate, gracious, slow to wrath, and abounding in love. Compassion, grace, rage, and love are all abstract words concepts that cannot be felt with the senses. Why are these abstract phrases found in a portion that Hebrews is full of concrete thinking? These are actually abstract English words that were employed to translate the physical Hebrew words. Because the original Hebrew make no sense when translated literally for Western thought, translators frequently do so. In line with that, there were not many abstract ideas to be conveyed in biblical Hebrews. The lack of words indicate the absence of thoughts. For example, the problem of outward perception is a metaphysical problem, or the only states in which we can experience direct consciousness are the modification created within a neurological system, would be untranslatable in ancient Hebrew. Every generalization, or better still, every general truth expressed by the Hebrew is given with the highest directness, and in phraseology as visual, as elemental, as transparent, as stimulating to imagination and feeling as possible.
As what my groupmate has just stated, Hebrew language is the very language of poetry and prose. It is the medium of exposing the intensity of the feelings and coherence of thought. Let's first dwell into the importance of Hebrew poetry. This is divided into two: the prominence of poetry in the scriptures and the unique relevance of it to Hebrew poetic literature. The prominence of poetry in the scriptures. Number 1, the poetry and wisdom section of the English Old Testament is cast almost entirely in poetic verse. Number 2, a large portion of the prophets section of the English Bible is cast also in poetic verse. Number 3, the narrative texts are interspersed with poetry. And number 4, approximately 1/3 of the entire Old Testament can be considered poetry. The unique relevance of Hebrew poetic literature. Number 1, for many Christians, Psalms and Proverbs are the favorite books of the Old Testament. These works describe humanity's relationship to God from the perspective of the believer. Because they reflect the entire range of human emotions, there are passages that will minister to people in any situation in life. Number 2, the prophets also have direct and obvious relevance. In contrast to Hebrew narrative, in which the message is often implicit, the prophetic messages are usually explicit. They tend to be powerful, direct, and evocative, even as they call for immediate application. Thus, transference of the prophet's theological insights to the contemporary scene is often more readily apparent. Number 3, while the technicalities of Hebrew poetry may render these works initially more difficult to understand than Hebrew narrative, there is usually little difficulty in demonstrating the contemporary relevance of the theological message once it is ascertained. Next is the types of Hebrew poetry. Number 1, Psalms. Psalms is the book of the Old Testament composed of sacred songs or of sacred poems meant to be sung. Example are hymns, thanksgiving, royal psalms, window psalms, wisdom psalms, laments, liturgies. Number 2, wisdom writings. It consists of statements by sages and the wise that offer teachings about divinity and virtue. Example are proverbs, legends, riddles, and sayings. Number 3, prophecy. It is an inspired utterance of a prophet and a declaration of divine will and purpose. Example are threats, judgment, salvation, visions, disputations, judicial speeches, and laments. Number 4, others like funerary dirges or a song of grief intended to accompany funeral or memorial rites, songs of war, curses, drinking songs, and love poems. And there are also types of Hebrew prose. First is narrative style, a form of writing in which the work tells a definite story through actions. Examples are saga, tale, novella, legend, and myth. Another style is reportorial, which includes historiography or an analysis of the interpretations of written by past historians, biography, a written history of a person's life, genealogy, the study of family origins and history, and list. It is a series of particular images, details, or facts. Now we are going to talk about their characteristics in terms of formal features. This will allow us to distinguish between the poetry and prose. Number 1, line length. This is the most basic distinction between prose and poetry. In Hebrew poetry, the average line length is 3 to 4 words, each having one beat in a metrical system, consisting of 8 to 9 syllables. While in prose, there is no restriction about the length of sense units. Number 2, parallelism of members. A second feature of poetry is cold, which has been long considered to be the defining characteristics of Hebrew poetry. The poetry does not have the parallels of mere synonyms in poetic parallelism, while in prose, there is only repetition of exact words, but there is no parallelism. Literary devices. Number 3. A third feature of Hebrew poetry is that it tends to use more literary devices than does prose. Hebrew prose does make use of literary and rhetorical devices, but they are of different types and they are not usually packed as densely into prose narratives as they are into poetic texts. Next is their characteristics based on their content. And number 1, selectivity. Because of the constrictions associated with short line lengths, poets tend to be more highly selective of their choice and number of words than writers of prose narratives. Number 2, figurative language. Figurative language finds a home more readily in poetic expression than in prose. Poetry is more often the conveyor of deep emotions, and it breaks more easily into figurative expression. Number 3, the stage. The stage on which events unfold in prose is usually limited to earthly events on an earthly stage. Poetry reaches into the heavenless more often than the prose. And number 4, time frame. Prose narrative is usually written from a past time perspective. It's in nature to attempts giving an account of the past to present to future time frames. Poetry is not so limited. It ranges from past to present to future time frames. To sum it all up, poetry differs from prose narratives in both form and content. This does not mean that poetry and prose cannot be found together. As we have noted, not all prose is historical narrative. Outside the historical books, we find large bodies of laws that are prose but not historical narrative.
Genesis, the creation. Moses is considered to be the author of this famous work in the Bible. Early Jewish and Christian traditions considered Moses as the author of the Torah or law or teachings, also called the Pentateuch or 5 books, comprising the first 5 books of the Bible including Genesis. He was also viewed as the most important prophets in Judaism and one of the most important prophets in Christianity, Islam, the Druze faith, the Baha'i faith, and other Abrahamic religions. According to both the Bible and the Quran, Moses was the leader of the Israelites and lawgiver to him the authorship of Torah was attributed. As it was stated in the Bible, as he was a God's servant and prophet who saved the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. And God gave, through him, the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Moving with the content of Genesis, the creation, Genesis was written around 1450 to 1410 before Christ. Genesis is called the Book of Beginnings or Book of Origins. The Greek word Genesis means origins, birth, or beginnings. The ancient Hebrews called the book Bereshit, meaning in the beginning, which are the first words of the text. It is also sometimes referred to as the first book of Moses. Chapter 1 of Genesis focuses on God's creation of the world on 7 days, in which, as the Bible stated, on the first day God created light and separated the light from the darkness, calling light day and darkness night. On the second day God created an expanse to separate the waters and called it sky. On the third day, God created the dry ground and gathered the waters, calling the dry ground land, and the gathered waters seas. God also created vegetarian or plants and trees in this day. On the fourth day, God created the sun, moon, and the stars to give light to the earth and to govern and separate the day and the night. These would also serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years.
On the fifth day, God created every living creature of the seas and every winged bird, blessing them to multiply and fill the waters and the sky with life. On the sixth day, God created the animals to fill the earth. He also created man and woman, named Adam and Eve, in His own image, to commune with Him. He blessed them and gave them every creature and the whole earth, to rule over, care for, and cultivate. On day 7, God had finished His work of creation, and so He rested on the seventh day, blessing it and making it holy. Next, regarding with the setting, most of the story in Genesis is set in the Middle East region. Places in Genesis include the Garden of Eden, the mountains of Ararat, Babel, Ur, Hanan, Shechem, Hebron, Beersheba, Bethel, and Egypt, in which God's miraculous works, starting with His creation, how man falls to sin, and how He saved His people happen. While the characters portrayed in the story are God, Adam and Eve, and all creatures on earth. As God is the creator, Adam, Eve, and all creatures are His creations. Talking about the lesson of the book of Genesis, this tells humans on how powerful God is, showing that every creature in this world are all God's masterpieces. We should learn to appreciate it, especially the humankind. We are created as God-like image, beautifully and wonderfully created only by Him. Another masterpiece of Jews is the Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is written by King David. David, a shepherd boy and the author of this psalm, and later to be known as the Shepherd King of Israel. Many scholars believe that it is written during David's kingship, which began over the tribe of Judah in 1000 BC and extended over the whole of Israel in 993 before Christ. He is described in the Hebrew Bible as the third king of the united monarchy of Israel and Judah. In the books of Samuel, David is a young shepherd and a harpist who gains fame by slaying the giant Goliath, a champion of the Philistines in southern Canaan. The meaning of Psalm 23 is a song of gratitude to a loving God in a painful world. David expresses confidence and trust in the Lord by portraying God as a good shepherd who both guides and blesses them. God's goodness means that they have nothing to fear. Whatever happens to them, God will be with them. In Psalm 23 verse 1, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." With this assurance in God's protection, he concludes that his shepherd will also be there for him. As the tender shepherd, David had the final assurance that all his needs will be supplied, and as a result, he has placed his total dependence on God. While in Psalm 23 verse 2 it says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures, He leads me beside still waters." For David, this analogy is also used to refer to being in a state of abundance where he will continue to grow and flourish. Abiding in this state is also where the ever-present peace of God dwells. In Psalm 23 verse 3 it says, "He restores my soul, He leads me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake." Even in the midst of this quiet, this restoration brings forth a wellspring of joy where all worries and stress are eliminated. This great confidence in God's care and protection allows him to rest. In Psalm 23 verse 4 it says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Throughout life's journey, there are sometimes dark situations, but with the assurance of God's abiding presence, even in death, David can face any pitfalls as he is conscious that the protection of God will always hover over him. These are some of the verses written in Psalm 23 that clearly portrays how David put his trust in Almighty God as he was the sheep and God is the shepherd of his life. The poem's setting takes place in two different imaginative spaces, the outside world and the inner soul. Everything that's described in the real world is really a means of symbolically representation what the speaker feels in his soul. The characters in this piece are God as a shepherd and King David as a sheep who let God to move and work in his life. And the lesson reflected in Psalm 23 is, putting our trust in God alone can be a strong foundation for us to live with confidence. Life can be overwhelming, but God's presence is always with us through the deepest valleys and challenges of life.
Ecclesiastes comes from a Greek word indicating a person who calls an assembly, so it makes sense that the author identified himself in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 1 by the Hebrew word kohelet, translated as preacher. King Solomon authored Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes provides relevant wisdom for Christians today who struggle with the seemingly meaningless of life. When was Ecclesiastes written? So some have dated the book in the 3rd or 4th century BC, claiming that the Hebrew of the book has characteristics of post-biblical Hebrew and that there is discernible influence from Greek philosophy. So this view, while popular among some scholars, must treat the book as a royal fiction, a genre well known in both Mesopotamia and Egypt. So the content of Ecclesiastes reflects someone looking back on a life that was long unexperienced but short on lasting rewards. The message of Ecclesiastes is that the course of life to be pursued is a God-centered life. The pleasures of life are not intrinsically fulfilling and cannot offer lasting satisfaction, but they can be enjoyed as gifts from God. Life offers good times and bad, and follows no pattern such as that proposed by the retribution principle, but all comes from the hand of God. It says that in Ecclesiastes 7:14 that when times are good, be happy, but when times are bad, consider this, that God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything but their future. Ecclesiastes is important because Ecclesiastes presents us naturalistic vision of life, one that sees life through distinctly human eyes but ultimately recognizes the rule and reign of God in the world. This more humanistic quality has made the book especially popular among younger audiences today. Men and women who have seen more than their fair share or pain and instability in life but who still cling to their hope in God. We have 3 lessons from Ecclesiastes. Number 1 is, right now, we live in time but we were made for more. Meaning that though we live our lives on a timeline now, birth, life, and death, yet Ecclesiastes says that he has put eternity into man's heart but in such a way that he can fully understand yet. The number 2 is, life only has meaning when lived in relationship with God. Meaning that Solomon wants his readers to know that he has tried everything in a relentless pursuit to find the meaning of life. The third one is, joy can be found in life through gratitude from God's gifts. Meaning that life is a gift, though it sounds like a cliche. Deep down, we know this is true. We did not create ourselves, and after all, what we do, half that we did receive. It says in Corinthians chapter 4 verse 7, and though life is full of hardship, it is also full of beauty if we have eyes to see. The story of Joseph is found in the first book of the Bible, which is Genesis. Joseph was one of the 12 tribes of Israel, a son of Jacob and his wife Rachel, known as the Righteous One. He was favored by his father, who gave him a special colored coat, and sold by his brothers to Egypt, where he ultimately became ruler of the land, second only to the king, Pharaoh. The settings of the story is in the Egypt in the marketplace of Avaris. The character of the story are Joseph, the 11 brothers, the 3 ladies, Ismaelites, Potiphar, Miss Potiphar, Baker, Butler, and Pharaoh. The theme are civil rivalry, parental favoritism, revenge, immigration, refuge, famine and food supplies, and forgiveness. The life of Joseph gives a testament of the sovereignty and the grace of God for those who live faithfully and righteously. Despite being sold into slavery by his brothers, Joseph remained faithful and trusted in God to deliver him from tribulation. Additionally, this story shows how God's plan may not be obvious to our limited perspective, but indeed, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to His purpose, let us be inspired by the Bible story of Joseph to have faith through our trials, knowing that God will deliver us in the glory of His justice. For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. It says in Romans chapter 8 verse 18. The moral of the story is, God watches and prepares our bright future even when we go through hardships, sufferings. All we need to do is to trust and obey Him.
The story of Ruth. The book of Ruth relates to that Ruth and Orpah, 2 women of Moab, had married 2 sons of Elimelech and Naomi. Judeans who had settled in Moab to escape famine in Judah. The husbands of all 3 women die. Naomi plans to return her native Bethlehem and urges her daughters-in-law to return to their families. Orpah does so, but Ruth refuses to leave Naomi. Ruth accompanies Naomi to Bethlehem and later marries Boaz, a distant relative of her late father-in-law. She's a symbol of abiding loyalty and devotion. Characters: Elimelech, Mahlon and Chilion, Naomi, Orpah, Ruth, Boaz, Pelomi Almoni, and Baby Obed. Lesson: remember to be humble and keep working as God blesses you. Content: the parable of the prodigal son, also known as the parable of the 2 brothers, lost son, loving father, or of the forgiving father, is one of the parables of Jesus in the Bible appearing in Luke 15:11-32. Jesus shares the parable with his disciples, the Pharisees, and others. Characters: the book deals with 3 personages: the younger, prodigal son, the self-righteous, resentful, and older son, and the compassionate father, all of whom the author identifies with personally. Lesson: the main message of the prodigal son is that it doesn't matter how far we stray away from our Heavenly Father or how much we squander the gifts He provides. He is always excited when we turn back to Him. His unconditional love is waiting for us to return home, where He greets us with open arms. The Good Samaritan. The parable of the Good Samaritan is told by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. It's about a traveler who is stripped of clothing, beaten, and left half to death alongside the road. First, a Jewish priest and then a man of Levite comes by but avoid the man. Characters: the characters of parable are a Jewish traveler, a Jewish priest, a Jewish Levite, and a Samaritan. The one telling the story is Jesus, and he is speaking to an expert of the law. Love your neighbor as yourself means love everyone. Helping the person who needs help is helping Christ.